Hey everyone, in this video I am going to be reading to you my my thoughts on Lanval and Gawain and the Green Knight. Okay, so I posted these for you to read, but I thought it might also be useful for some of you to hear me read them and then also maybe comment on some of the things that I'm saying. So I'm just going to put them both into one video. Your next response, will be responding to these two works. So hopefully you will find this useful. Um, Shifting from the epic Beowulf to the romances Lanval and Gawain and the Green Knight can be a little jarring. Whereas Beowulf comes on the scene ready to prove himself against any monster that comes his way, these poems present us with knights that don't seem to have much to prove. They are mostly secure in their fame and legend. In what appears to be a time of relative peace, knights are largely tasked with navigating the sexual politics of King Arthur's England. These seem to be poems that are as much about maintaining honor as earning it, as our heroes face the temptations that come with, well, being celebrities. Of course, the conventions of romance, and I'm speaking of the genre of romance, as it applies to these works. The conventions would be the path from social separation to reintegration, imply a more existential reckoning. And we do get some hints of angst in week 4's reading of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, though not as much as you would expect. For Lanval's hero, temporarily leaving Arthur's court is the best thing that could ever have happened to him. Homesick and underappreciated by the king, though still the envy of most, he is quickly surrounded by mysterious, gorgeous women, the most beautiful of which promises him anything he wants, and she does mean anything, as long as he doesn't tell anyone about her. Returning with some of her riches, he suddenly finds himself appreciated by nearly everyone, particularly Queen Guinevere. But unable to be with or tell others of his newfound love, Lanval is still forlorn. I can't help but wonder what Beowulf would think of all this. So what I'm trying to point out here in this paragraph is just the extent to which, in contrast to, say, Beowulf, your hero's journey involves heading into danger, and difficult circumstances. Lanval's journey here, his social separation from the court, seems like a pretty good deal for him. Surrounded by beautiful women, one of whom pledges herself to him. You kind of get the sense that he's going to be okay. So a definite contrast here from what we see with Beowulf. At its core, Lanval is a story about the power of female beauty and sexual appetite. These are the challenges our hero must navigate. In fact, the women drive the action here. Lanval's Ami rescues him from despondency. Queen Guinevere makes a pass at him. In both instances, the women are in positions of power, and the question is how Lanval will respond. In the case of his Ami, this power seems supernatural in origin, as though her beauty were itself a spell that puts anything within her grasp. Guinevere's power is more political, but its relationship to her beauty is also presumed. What distinguishes Lanval's Ami is that, unlike Guinevere, she does not need a king to legitimize her power. If anything, this fact alone demonstrates that her beauty exceeds the queen's. We might even say that Lanval is the Guinevere to her Arthur. The story ends with her rescuing him from execution, with his jumping on her horse and riding off to Avalon. The point being that, if Guinevere needs King Arthur to provide her with agency and political power, Lanval is the one who seems to be dependent on his Ami, on this woman. Lanval is one of the few works of this period written by a woman, which may explain her inversion of the gender power structure of the time. Though her female agency is the byproduct of the women's physical beauty and their ability to essentially emasculate Lanval with that beauty. When Guinevere questions his manhood by referring to rumors that he is a homosexual, Lanval feels compelled to prove his manhood, breaking his promise and praising the supremacy of his Amée's beauty. The heteronormative overtures cannot be too surprising, but this moment is worth remembering when you read the rest of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, where the homoerotic undertones are hard to miss. In this case, Lanval, ironically, needs a woman to prove his manhood just as the women need the appreciation of men to demonstrate their feminine power. Guinevere's beauty is on trial just as much as Lanval's honesty. And though the Amie doesn't need a king to draw power from, her power has no political agency. The Amie lives a nameless existence outside of history. I'll have more to say about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight next week, but I do want to point out that the Green Knight plays a similar role to the poem as the Amie. The Green Knight is more blatantly supernatural, but both are mysterious outsiders whose powers are disruptive to the politics of court. The dilemma that the Green Knight presents, his challenge, as King Arthur points out, is obviously fixed, yet honor decrees that the challenge must be met, makes a mockery of the chivalric code. Unlike Grendel, the Green Knight is not a threat to be disposed. He is courteous, not violent. Yet the Green Knight is confident that his boast will not go unchallenged. Unsurprisingly, no one wants to take him up on the dare until King Arthur must come forward in place of his knights. Only when faced with this extra slight to his honor does Gawain accept the Green Knight's challenge, the extra slight being the fact that King Arthur is willing to sacrifice himself in place of his knights, when it should be the opposite. But since it is a test that Gawain seems destined to lose, Gawain's bravery only strips him of political and personal agency. His date of death now set, Gawain can only live out his days until he must leave the court entirely to place his head compliantly beneath the Green Knight's axe. This contradiction, honor as something potentially debilitating and isolating, is teased out even more in his ensuing adventure, which becomes a test of his sexual restraint as much as it is his courage. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead, and that was the week 3 posting that I made, so I'm going to jump ahead to the week 4 posting, where I discuss that journey in a little more detail. Much of the tension in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight comes not from the inevitable encounter with the Green Knight, but the repeatedly tested chastity of Sir Gawain. Fittingly, the big reveal is that the Green Knight is Bertilac. But the wife, Morgan Le Fay, is the real instigator of the story's plot. She, and quoting from the text, "She guided me in disguise to your great hall, to put pride on trial, and to test with this great trick what distinction and trust the Round Table deserves." While Gawain probably passes the distinction part of the test by having the courage to accept the Green Knight's challenge, proving his trustworthiness turns out to be the real test. The psychosexual dimensions of this test are fascinating. Gawain must reject the persistent advances of Morgan Le Fay, who is, of course, in disguise, at least partly because his honesty dictates following Bertilac's agreement of reciprocity. Whatever sexual prize he gains from Morgan Le Fay must be given to Bertilac, which Gawain does with increasing intensity. His last kisses are given to Bertilac with as much emotion as a man can muster. A Freudian analysis, which typically looks at the role of repressed sexual energies, might suggest that this intensity represents a release of the sexual repression that Gawain must undergo to deny Morgan Le Fay's flirtations. The homosexual nature of this release ironically both maintains and threatens the social order. If Gawain transgresses further than a kiss with Morgan Le Fay, he is bound by honor to do the same with Bertilac. While the potential of a homosexual encounter keeps Gawain's honor in check, it also leaves room for an acceptable transgression. There's arguably a sexual dimension to the Green Knight's challenge as well. The two men exchanging roles of dominance and submission, the threat of penetration and symbolic castration, that enacts the homosexual encounter and anxieties that Gawain avoids by only kissing Morgan Le Fay. One aside here that I want to make is that, by all indication and evidence, the idea of homosexuality as a, as a sexual identity didn't really exist, or only really has existed in the last 200 years, right? So the idea of somebody, being kind of identifying themselves or being identified as gay, there's not much indication that that really existed at this time, though, homosexual acts, encounters, urges, are prominent, in pretty much all literature that has existed throughout all time. Or maybe if not prominent, they are evident. So when we sort of, thinking of this in terms of, is Sir Gawain actually gay, is less the point than, than that perhaps the text seems to acknowledge that, that perhaps, having homosexual urges, is not uncommon, right? And so, and that it's possible for Sir Gawain to also perhaps have some of these urges, and that perhaps part of what's happening in the text is, treating the, sort of addressing some of these underlying anxieties that that society, particularly the society at the time, encourages people to keep under wraps, right? Encourages people to repress. So that's part of what, that's the idea that I'm going with here. Recall Guinevere's accusation of homosexuality in Lanval and its assumption that such behavior is unmanly, dishonorable. Sir Gawain in the Green Knight does not dispel this assumption per se, but it does explore the underlying tensions that link gender, sexuality, honor for the knights of King Arthur's court. With no battles to fight, the knights do not have the traditional opportunities to prove their manhood that, say, Beowulf has. Perhaps the romance expresses an underlying fear of losing this manhood, as preserving order in the age of King Arthur requires maintaining a careful balance between tendencies traditionally defined as masculine and feminine, heterosexual and homosexual, honorable and transgressive. The conventions of romance dictate that this balance be disrupted by the Green Knight and his challenge. For Gawain, accepting the challenge requires the disintegration and ironic upheaval of his masculine and heteronormative identity. Gawain navigates this distinction through adherence to his chivalric code, but can only do so by allowing himself an indiscretion. Note that wearing the girdle is not only an act of deception, but a transgression of gender norms that both effeminizes and sexualizes Sir Gawain. And I'm quoting here from the text, with some omissions. The lady's lace girdle at his shapely hips truly suited Sir Gawain and went well with the rich red weaves that he wore. Okay, those are from lines 2030 to 2036. The possibility of sexual and gender-based transgression allows for the reintegration of not only Gawain, but also the non-normative sexual urges suggested, if not exposed by the Green Knight's disruption. In the end, similar girdles become an iconic, lasting accessory for King Arthur's entire court, lords, ladies, and knights alike, as a reminder and symbol of those sins that, quote, can be covered but never made clean, which is from line 2511. So again, what I'm doing here at the end is sort of positioning all this within the conventions of romance, you know, as explained in the chapter and you know, in the module in Blackboard. This idea that the genre of romance typically takes a knight from being socially integrated to a state of disintegration and isolation, and back to a reintegration with society, right? So Gawain is part of society. He has to leave society. He comes back to society. But that this also, this idea of sort of integration, disintegration, reintegration, could also be a way of thinking about how the story and you know, and how the poem deals with sexuality, right? That, you know, initially that, you know, sort of the heteronormative views of sexuality at the time, you know, that are sort of purely, you know, that the norm is heterosexuality and heterosexual behavior and heterosexual urges, that those norms become in a sense sort of disintegrated by the conflict in the story, and how, you know, Gawain has to both sort of resist the advances of the woman, but also share his kisses with the man, right? I mean, it's not that subtle, right? And the idea that, well, you know, if he does sleep with the wife, who we find out is Morgan Le Fay, then honor would dictate that he has to return the gift to Bertilac, to the man, that he has to sleep with the man. So, you know, so this scenario is sort of resolved by kind of a reintegration, perhaps, and this is my theory, you know, a reintegration of those non-normative impulses, you know, and back into society, and it's sort of reintegrated through this idea of, you know, the allowance of a transgression, okay, that acknowledges the sin, you know, or the crime of, you know, of having, you know, of having sexual urges, whether they be homosexual, you know, just I think the idea in general, perhaps, of sexuality that does not fit the norms of society, so that allows for that to exist but remain covered, and in a sense covered, you know, symbolically by the girdle. But the fact that this girdle becomes kind of this like iconic piece of dress for the entire court suggests that, you know, these urges, you know, are perhaps not just Sir Gawain's, but they sort of represent, you know, the kind of sexual conflicts, the conflicted sexuality of the entire court, in all its guises. So those are my thoughts. Again, hopefully, putting it in a video form, hearing me read it, maybe clarifies some of what I've written or makes it more engaging, perhaps. But you can also find these on in Blackboard. I posted them in the announcements and in the folder and course content. All right, thank you.